College football nerds here to give our top 10 after a really busy week in college football. It's week 12, top 10. Got a ton to talk about. It's a lot of T's. Y'all want to remind you, as we do every week, the best thing you can do for us, besides subscribe, is give us a thumbs up, a like, a love it if you can, and a comment. In the comment section, give us your top 10. Tell us how crazy we are, because this was a really hard top 10 for us. And Josh, the sort of tenor of our discussion, because we've had a lot of pre-chat about this, is going to be sort of intellectual consistency in the way we do our top 10s. And I'm giving everybody out there a bit of a trigger warning, because we don't do our top 10s the way that AP voters do them, the way college football fans are used to doing them, where basically clean record moves up, you lose, you move down, and that's that. We look at a couple of things just to remind everybody. One, we try to see when we're looking at two close teams, how would the other team do with if they swap schedules, knowing what we know about how each team did against their schedule. And then would these two teams win on a neutral field? And if not, it's not fair to punish somebody one way or the other. So for me, last week and for about a month and a half now, I've had Ohio State number one, and I've still got them number one. Y'all hold on just a second and let me explain. I know that LSU is shooting up to the top after their big win against Alabama. My issue is, again, intellectual consistency, and then we can go two ways on this. One way is, and the way that I'm going is, I already had Ohio State number one, which means I think Ohio State beats either of these two teams on a neutral field. So if we're being consistent, then I think either one of those two teams beating each other shouldn't matter to the team that I think is better than both of them right now. So that's why I have Ohio State number one. You could turn it around and say, okay, but that was a really close game, and you think Ohio State is probably a 3 to 5 point favorite on a neutral field. LSU proved that they were that. Ohio State is still hypothetically that. So go ahead and go with the one that we've seen actually win the game, which I think is a completely fair criticism of the way that we're doing this. But I still think Ohio State beats either one of these teams. So for now, I got Ohio State number one. Give me your number one.
It's also Ohio State for the same reason. And we've had this discussion from the beginning that's how we're approaching it, which is we are taking strength of schedule into account. We are talking how you do against your opponents and considering how good they are. But our question is, if you played that schedule, how would you look? Ohio State's schedule, given that last game between Alabama and LSU, is not nearly as tough as LSU's. I would say that. And now LSU, some of their opponents have lost some luster, but when you add Alabama into the mix, LSU's schedule is a lot tougher. The thing is, they win by a score against Auburn. They win by a score against Alabama. They win close against Florida. I'm not sure that Ohio State doesn't control those games. In fact, I kind of think they do control them the way they've been playing. And LSU and Alabama both showed a lot of deficiencies defensively, and Ohio State has not shown any such deficiency. And I'll say Alabama, LSU have shown deficiencies offensively against average teams. The other one, Clemson, they've shown deficiencies offensively against average teams, and Ohio State's just been a juggernaut all around, and that's why I have Ohio State number one.
Yeah, and I would also say, I don't know that Ohio State beats either one of these teams by more than 5 points like LSU did, but I do wonder if Ohio State if they inherit so many mistakes that Alabama made, which I predicted, by the way, those mistakes. I don't know that they don't beat them by more than 5 points. All right, I'm going to do my next one is LSU. That one is easy. I'm going to do 2, 3, and 4 because I have to explain 3 and 4 because I'm about to piss everybody off again. I have LSU number 2. I have Alabama number 3. And this is where I started a few minutes ago by saying this is different from how you're used to it. I have Alabama number 3. It really stops. The question is Alabama or Clemson in this slot, right? Because I don't think anybody reasonably would have an Oregon ahead of Alabama at this point. Does anybody think Alabama's going to lose by 6 to Auburn? I don't think so. They might, and we have that game and we'll see. But my thing with Alabama obviously behind LSU. They just lost to them. To move Alabama past Clemson is to reward Clemson for having not played anyone nearly as good as Alabama or LSU this year, and punishing Alabama for a team that we're saying is better than Clemson and losing to them by 5 points. I can't say that I think this changes my opinion about Clemson. It doesn't really change my opinion about Alabama or LSU either. We thought they were really good. They played a really good game. It was fun to watch. Alabama lost by 5 points. Does Clemson lose by 5 points to LSU, especially in a hole that Alabama dug themselves? I don't know that they do, or I don't know that they beat them or play that close to them. And I don't think they beat Alabama right now. So that's my 2, 3, and 4. I just can't punish Alabama for playing LSU when effectively I think the same or worse result would happen to Clemson.
My 2, 3, and 4 are the same. And we had some discussion before the show on this. I think both of us kind of hated that the other one, we like to write these out and then say where we were at. And sometimes we do a little bit of an adjustment when we're talking just because we realize, oh, I kind of forgot about that game being close or something like that. But we try not to play off each other. In this case, we're hoping the other one would have Clemson ahead of Alabama and LSU ahead of Ohio State because it would make it easier to do the video. But the truth is we're both of the same opinion on this. It's easy to say, well, we know Alabama would lose to LSU and we don't know that Clemson would lose to LSU. But we also don't know that Clemson could stay that close to LSU. And we don't know it because they haven't played a tough schedule. And we've said this since the beginning. If you lose to a team that's ahead of you and ahead of another team, we're not necessarily going to drop you below, Team C because you lost to better Team A that we think would also beat Team C. Alabama and Clemson are really close in my book, and Clemson's been a lot stronger, but the competition's just been so weak. Like the NC State team they just played. Guys, NC State has gotten blown out multiple times. They're not a good team.
By bad teams.
By bad teams. They're not good. And, they beat, they whip up on Boston College. Again, same problem. These are bad teams that are getting blown out by other bad teams. The one data point is North Carolina beating South Carolina. And South Carolina had a couple games where they played good football for a few weeks and then has been just trash outside that. Not just in the SEC, not just non-conference, but also within the SEC. They've been, get destroyed by Missouri or something like that. So there's not a lot of reason for me to think the ACC is in any way tough. Most of the advanced metrics right now.
You got a second data point, right? I mean, you have an actual common opponent.
Right. I mean, and that's very true. Texas A&M played Alabama and Clemson. It's a minor thing, and it's splitting hairs, but we kind of have to. Alabama did beat A&M by more than Clemson did.
And Alabama was on the road, and Clemson was at home.
And I think A&M actually played Alabama better and still lost by more. And it's easy to say Clemson's defense is better, and I do think it's better. But Alabama's offense was a lot better against A&M than Clemson's was. On the whole, I think Alabama's a slightly better team. And the one loss Alabama had is to a team that is still ranked ahead of them and still ranked ahead of Clemson, and that's why we shake out the way we do right now. I do think if Clemson runs the table and they're undefeated and they're an undefeated P5 champ, even in our model, I think you have to give something to that credence on it, just sort of on its face. But I will say we're kind of hedging away from that because we do want to stay true to the strength of the schedule and being honest with who you've played. But I will also say in the committee's eyes, it won't shock me if Clemson is maybe shakier in the committee's eyes than people are expecting, because the committee is not going to view Clemson as an undefeated P5 champ. They are not going to view them that way until the championship game, and people need to understand that.
Yeah, and I think it's academic, really. These are clearly the 4 best teams in the country. A lot of people are not going to want Alabama to get in. They're going to say you lost your one good game. But here again, we're going to have a team in Alabama. It's always just Alabama. It's always the SEC West, where you lose one game and you lose your division. And you can't say that for any other division in football. And we're going to have it again this year with Alabama. Nobody, and Oregon's my number 5 team, nobody with a straight face can tell me that Oregon is better than Alabama or Clemson. So it's really academic. I do think there's going to be a lot of argument, and Alabama may not make the playoffs, and that's a different discussion. But what I'm saying right now, neutral field, these are the top 4 teams. There's a big gap, and then you have the rest. So if Alabama and Clemson are fighting 3 and 4, they're fighting to play LSU and Ohio State. So I don't think it really matters. I think for once this year, we have 4 really good teams that could fill 4 slots. My next 2, when we can pick up the pace, I've got Oregon, then Georgia. Oregon is really high for me. They're the high of the next group because I like how they're playing lately. I know you don't love the recency thing, and there are some concerns with me given that they've been playing well against a weaker schedule lately, and they had ugly wins against an okay Washington team and a kind of bad Washington State team. Close, ugly 17-7, I think it was, against Cal. But Georgia's loss is worse, clearly worse, even though Georgia has come on late, and Georgia has a good win over Florida that Oregon does not. That's my 5 and 6. Give me yours.
So my 5 and 6 are Georgia and Utah. I do think Georgia is probably deservedly punished for losing to South Carolina. I think they're flawed in a lot of ways, but Georgia is still a rather good team. And that beating Florida kind of confirmed what I thought about Georgia, and we talked about in that preview. Right now in SP+, they're the second best defense behind Ohio State. And their offense is not fantastic, but it's still 18th. They're playing ball control, which is giving them the ability to lose any game, because right now any team can score in this new current era of RPOs and whatnot at any moment. Even bad teams can score in really good ones. But they're still an awesome defense, better than Clemson statistically. And they're an offense that's also quite good. And that's why I have Georgia number 5. Utah is my number 6. And I struggle with Utah and Oregon. And I'm going to go ahead and say this now. I don't have Oregon in my top 10. And we'll get on the point later. It's hard to split the hair between Utah and Oregon. Who's better? I have a problem with Oregon because, another hint, I'm going to have Auburn in my top 10. And Auburn beat Oregon. And Oregon, but that's Oregon's only loss. And you say, well, okay, Oregon's played really well lately, like with USC. They definitely had a better job against Slovis than anybody else has. But they also had a close game against Washington State. Utah killed Washington State. They both had similarly close games against Washington. And I have this weird, I'm weirdly punishing them for playing Auburn and losing to them, and I'm realizing that in my head. But I also kind of think maybe Utah's a better team. I don't know. I feel like I'm inconsistent, and I can't figure out how to solve it, frankly, between Utah and Oregon.
Well, the other thing with Oregon, we do this a lot, and I talked about it at the beginning. Do we think that Oregon loses to LSU on the road 23-20? Do we think that Oregon beats Florida on the road? Because those are Auburn's 2 losses, right? Like, I don't know that Oregon, like, at that point you're punishing, like we said, it's not really fair to punish Alabama over Clemson when Clemson wouldn't do any better. I don't want to do this anymore because I'm talking myself out of Oregon's ranking, where I have them, and it's too late in the game for me to change it. So they are where they are.
I will say this, and I think you agree with me. The top of the Pac-12 is very confusing. They've been very inconsistent.
Super confusing.
And, I mean, there are a lot of people that think even through the last few games of this season with Utah and Oregon that you're somehow going to end up with a 2-loss champion in the Pac-12. A lot of people really believe it.
It would require a pretty big upset because I was looking at that yesterday to see if it's a possibility. For me, you know what? I'm doing this live. I'm sorry, y'all. Utah is my number 5, and I'm moving Oregon to number 7 because I really value a lot of games where you handle your business, and 35-0 over Cal, 18-point win over Arizona State, killed everybody else, lost to USC, and then a close game at Washington, which is a tough place to play. I've got Utah ahead of Oregon. So Oregon would fill that slot for me, that number 7 slot. Number 8, I have Minnesota. I think there's 7 in the AP poll. They had a good win against Penn State, but we struggled with this. Yes, I think I said 35-24 Minnesota. But we had just as many question marks about Penn State as we did Minnesota when we did our review of this game last week. And we took a lot of heat from Penn State fans all year, and including our preview of that game, because we didn't love their offense and we didn't know who they were on defense. I tweeted a statistic that like all of their offensive opponents were in the 80s and 90s except for Michigan, who was 50th. They had faced a lot of terrible offensive teams. So Minnesota shoots up for a great home win, but I'm not sure they're ahead of. I don't know if they beat some of these other teams that are just behind them.
Yeah, and I think that's all kind of the problem there. So looking at mine, so I've said Georgia, Utah. So my 7-8. Did you do 9? Or you just finished with 8?
No, just 7 and 8.
That's right. Oklahoma 7. Florida is my number 8. You threw me off doing this live, but Oklahoma at number 7. That loss to Kansas State looks worse and worse by the day. It's just not, it's not a great thing. It's not a great team, but I still think Oklahoma's a great offense. I still see Oklahoma kind of dominating teams offensively, even though the games are close because the defense isn't that good. And it's a weird place with Oklahoma where if you look at like the yard per play gap in these games and their scoring potential gap, it's actually pretty significant. But the defense is bad enough to where they're scoring easy on offense and giving up points, but inflicting pain on defense. But the gap between the two in terms of actual scores is not that high. It's like you get a first down every play, and so you score in 3 plays, but they're scoring in 12 is basically what we're seeing from Oklahoma. They're a lot better than their teams that play. And to a certain degree, I think Oklahoma is the one team that could really scare teams above them because that gap is so big. But I also think as much as they'd scare teams above them because of their offense, and their offense would be able to score a lot, they're going to give up a ton of points to everybody ahead of them too. And it makes it really hard for me to rank teams higher with Oklahoma. Florida is my number 8, and Florida loses to LSU. They lose to Georgia. Again, LSU and Georgia are both ahead of them in the rankings. I know people are going to cry foul that there's so many SEC teams here in the top 10. The SEC is just deeper right now. And all these teams are as good.
SEC is deep, but they have a low floor. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I agree. The bottom of the SEC is quite bad. But these teams at the top of the SEC, they're not universally better than the non-SEC teams. Like, I have Ohio State number 1, but they are all kind of in the ballpark of it. And I do think Florida probably on odds beats everybody below them. I mean, they killed Vandy, and that's why I have them number 8.
You said what you said about Oklahoma, and I was fully prepared to move them up in that 5-6 range this weekend, maybe even ahead of Georgia. What I wanted to see was, okay, we're Oklahoma. We had a slip up against Kansas State. We had an off week to think about it. We're super pissed. And now we're going to come in and just brain Iowa State. And this is the Iowa State that scored 21 points on Baylor and 17 on Iowa. And what do we get? 42-41. And it pains me because I wanted Oklahoma to get back up off the mat and like roar back into it. And so I have Oklahoma. I have them at 10. So Florida 9, Oklahoma 10. And right now the difference for me is, and a lot of Oklahoma fans are saying, why is Georgia ranked so far ahead of us? Their loss is possibly worse than ours. First of all, I don't think it is. I think South Carolina would lose to Kansas State, but I don't think Kansas State's a good team. Yeah. Battered. Yeah. They've given up and they're battered. They've got 3 more starters out this weekend. But the issue is Georgia was mostly in control of that game other than turnovers and didn't trail until the final kick, whereas Oklahoma was getting drilled by 25 points in the fourth quarter. And Georgia has good wins under their belt where Oklahoma hasn't played anybody. So I've got Florida just ahead of them, and then I've got Oklahoma number 10. I really wanted to see Oklahoma do something else, so I actually dropped them a spot because the Iowa State game, I mean, they just couldn't finish. They did the opposite of what they did against Kansas State. It was 35-14 at one point, and then, gosh, they were a fumbled, well-placed ball away from losing that game. It was a great play to get the interception, but man, come on, help me out, Oklahoma.
Yeah, and I think you also have to bear in mind, too, that Georgia-Oklahoma comparison. That Georgia win over Notre Dame, which was looking like it wasn't going to be that big a deal, did end up being something. And I mean, Michigan may be a lot better than Notre Dame. Maybe Notre Dame's not great, but things like that are still bridging the gap from Oklahoma because Oklahoma just doesn't have that much competition right now. The Big 12 is not necessarily panning out that strongly. Maybe Baylor shows something, but we'll talk on that a little bit later. My 9 and 10 are Minnesota and Auburn. And with Minnesota, the tweet you put out, I went ahead and pulled it up. Penn State's number 2 scoring defense had faced a scoring offense is ranked 114th, 94th, 96th, 63rd, 50th. That was Michigan, 74th, 110th, and FCS. So that's, if you keep your track at home, 4 teams ranked 90th or worse, 2 in the 60 to 75 range, 1 ranked 50th in an FCS. I think Penn State's defense is pretty good. We weren't really sure how they were going to scale up, and they just didn't scale at all. They're I think a lot of times you can do pretty well by being sound up to a point, and then you face defenses that are good above it, and things can collapse. We see it all the time with Michigan. Quite frankly, the Big Ten has this problem because the quarterback play in the Big Ten has not been at a high level for a while, and the skill position talent is not consistent enough throughout the conference. So you have these weird sort of aberration games. The point being there, I think Minnesota undefeated. They breached the top 10. Why are they not getting higher than that? It's easy to say, and we said they would shoot up in the rankings and they would hit in the top 10, but this really, to me, confirmed a lot of things that Penn State had going wrong. Saying they beat Auburn's a big deal. I think they would get Florida a good game, but I still kind of feel like Oklahoma or Florida would probably beat Minnesota right now. And I still think Minnesota is going to end up losing later in the season, if nothing else, by the championship game. And then finally, 10th, Auburn. Again, Auburn beat Oregon. It's easy to say that Oregon was winning for much of that game, but Auburn was 21-7 down the stretch. I think if they played again, I actually do think Auburn would actually win that game. Auburn is not a bad team. They're not great offensively. They are very, very good defensively. That 23-20 game against LSU is looking really good right now, and LSU statistically did really well. That close game with Ole Miss looks bad, but I also don't think Ole Miss is a bad team. That's why I have Auburn there. I think that's kind of rounding it all out.
Yeah, the Penn State point to me, and I noticed it, and I said it I tweeted during the game. Penn State was out-athleting almost every player for Minnesota, Penn State defensively. They were faster. They were more athletic. Nothing was getting to the edge. Like run game wasn't really getting to the edge. The problem was scheme. They absolutely, and this is what happens, and this is why scheme is important. They played a bunch of, not completely Neanderthal football, but a lot of boring football, like with Iowa. That was one of their big wins. Michigan, one of their big wins. And yeah, technically Michigan runs an RPO scheme, but not really. Like, it's not good. And they've still got Shea Patterson doing a lot of reads. It's a lot of standard runs. They ran that same dive play all night that they've been running all year. This was the first quarterback and first team that really stretched them with scheme, and that really exposed them. So now what's going to happen when a team like Ohio State has scheme and is five-star city? I think it's going to show you why we said all year that the gap between 4 and 5 was massive. They got mad at us, and we don't always take victory laps. I may not even take one on this one, but this is why we say what we say and we don't really care who we piss off, because in the end, it's not because we hate your team. It's because we've watched your team play as much as you have, but we watched it as an analyst and not as a fan, and that makes all the difference. And now that we've eliminated all the Penn State fans who like to watch us, I just want to say again, we don't hate your team. That's just what we saw. Anything else on your top 10?
Yeah, and I'll interject that last point in Penn State because we're probably not going to touch on it too much more. Penn State is a really good team that was extremely limited at quarterback. And I say that in a little bit with Minnesota. If Penn State had just above average quarterback play, they win that game.
If they have Minnesota's quarterback, they win by 2 touchdowns.
Right. And that's the thing that concerns me about Minnesota. And that's why this game is more punishing Penn State than ratcheting up Minnesota. I mean, Minnesota did ratchet up in my rankings. They're a good team. And I wasn't sure at all going into this if they were even good or if really good or really bad. But what I saw was Penn State having, I think, 3 red zone turnovers that cost them the game that they probably still could have won against Minnesota. The gap was not that large, and it was at Minnesota. But Penn State was just incompetent at quarterback for most of that game. And that's not going to happen every week. And it's Minnesota was only really able to win because of that incompetence.
Well, and here's the deal. Like, here's how close that game was. They were an offensive pass interference play, which is never called in college football. A mild pick play, like a vertical pick play, not like a slant pick play, which is more egregious. A vertical pick play that was called, that was the difference. Penn State wins that game if that foul is not called, because they've got 1st and goal at the 2 with plenty of time to spare. And then that went from 1st and goal at the 2 to having to go like 18 yards, 1st or 2nd and 18, with a quarterback that couldn't do it. That was the difference in that game. So that, like you said, it's more punishing Penn State because it's not fair when they're that close to say, okay, well now Penn State's 18th and Minnesota's 5th because they're just too close. All right, y'all, that's our top 10 for this week. Let us know how crazy we are. I know. Let me go ahead and get the comment out for you. SEC homers, these are SEC guys, and they just love the SEC, blah, 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 blah. Give us reasons why we're wrong. Don't just ad hominem us to death. Tell us why we're wrong, and we'll engage in the comments. Tell us, hey, for once, maybe somebody tell us why we're right, and we'll engage you as well. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.